My granddaughter called me at 3:47 the morning. Her voice so broken I almost didn't recognize it. "Grandpa, please. Please come get me." When I arrived at her in-laws' estate outside Oakville, her mother-in-law filled the doorway, arms crossed, completely calm. "She's not going anywhere. Go home." I put my shoulder into that door and I wasn't polite about it. What I found at the top of those stairs made 67 years of patience evaporate in about 4 seconds. And what happened after that brought down one of the most powerful families in Ontario. As a grandparent, what would you do if the person you loved most was being held against her will? I need to hear from you. Please tell me in the comments below. My name is Frank Morrison. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 31 years as a fraud investigator with an Ontario insurance firm that contracted with the province. My wife Margaret called it my calling. My granddaughter calls it the reason I can't let anything go. She's not wrong. It started when Margaret got sick, ovarian cancer, treatable if caught early enough, but her specialist kept dismissing her symptoms as anxiety for 8 months. By the time someone ordered the right scan, it was too late. The hospital offered a settlement with conditions attached, a number with a lot of zeros and a document that meant we could never speak about what happened to anyone. I tore it in half in the lawyer's office and walked out. I couldn't bring her back, but I could make sure the same thing didn't happen to someone else's wife. I spent the next 4 years building a case with a patient advocacy group. 2 physicians lost their licenses. The hospital's complaints process was overhauled by the college. It didn't fix what I'd lost, but it was something. And that's what I do now. I follow the thread when something doesn't add up. Old habit. 31 years of fraud investigations will do that to a man. My granddaughter had been married for 18 months. Her husband's family owned and operated 6 private long-term care homes across Ontario, 1 in Burlington, 2 in the Greater Toronto Area, 1 outside Kingston, and 2 smaller ones near Barrie. The Caldwell name was everywhere in the industry. Fundraisers, provincial advisory boards, glossy brochures in hospital waiting rooms. Everything looked legitimate. Their marketing materials talked about dignity and compassionate care and person-centered support. I'd done enough insurance work to know that the shiniest operations often had the most to hide. I'd tried raising my concerns with my granddaughter, gently at first, then less gently. She told me I was projecting, that I saw corruption everywhere because of what happened to Margaret. Maybe she was right. I backed off, told myself to let her be happy. Margaret's voice is the thing that woke me up before my granddaughter even called. Not literally, but I'd been lying awake thinking about her, about the last conversation we had in the hospital before she stopped being able to have conversations. She'd held my hand and said, "Promise me you won't stop watching out for her. Promise me that no matter what." I'd promised. I meant it then. I still meant it at 3:47 the morning when my phone lit up on the nightstand. I answered before the second ring. "Grandpa." The word came out fractured, barely there. There was background noise, something hard hitting a surface. A man's voice, sharp and slurred at the same time. Then nothing. The line just ended. I was already out of bed pulling on my jacket. 31 years of fraud work teaches you not to stand still when your instincts are screaming. I grabbed my car keys, my phone, and the small voice recorder I kept in the drawer by the door. Old habits. The drive from Kingston to Oakville on the 401 takes about 2.5 hours on a good day. I don't know exactly how fast I drove. I know it wasn't 2.5 hours. My granddaughter's in-laws owned a property on a private road outside Oakville. Not a neighborhood, an estate. The kind of place where the gate code and the address don't appear on any public record. My granddaughter had given me the code 6 months earlier, after a visit where she'd seemed quieter than usual. I'd asked if everything was all right. She'd said, of course, and changed the subject. But she'd written the gate code on a small piece of paper and pressed it into my hand when I was leaving, like she was handing me something she might need me to have later. I punched in the code just before 5 in the morning. The gate opened. Every light in the main house was on. They knew I was coming. I took the front steps fast and knocked hard enough that my knuckles ached. The door opened about 6 inches. Her mother-in-law appeared in the gap. Silver hair, silk robe, completely composed for 5 in the morning. She looked at me the way you might look at a courier who'd shown up at the wrong address. She told me it was the middle of the night. I told her I was aware of that. I said my granddaughter had called me and I needed to see her. She said my granddaughter had been having a difficult time emotionally and the family had it under control. She said it with so much confidence it almost sounded reasonable. Then she said, "She's not going anywhere tonight. Go home, Frank." The way she used my first name. Like she'd rehearsed it. Like she expected me to deflate and back down because she'd used my name with that particular tone. I stepped back and I put my shoulder into the door, just below the handle. The chain gave on the second hit. The door swung in and she stumbled sideways. I walked past her. "Where is she?" Not a question. She told me I was committing break and enter. I told her to call whoever she wanted. Something upstairs. A sound that took me half a second to identify because I hadn't heard it in decades. The sound of someone crying very quietly and trying not to be heard. I went for the stairs. Her husband appeared from somewhere down the hall. Her mother-in-law's voice followed me up. I didn't slow down. The crying came from the third door on the right. Locked. I said her name. Said it was me. Her voice came back, so small it almost didn't reach me through the door. She said, "Please," just that word. I kicked that door 3 times before it went. What I found looked like a guest room at first. Expensive furniture. Good lighting when it came on. But the window had an exterior latch that couldn't be reached from inside. There was a deadbolt on the outside of the door I'd just broken. And my granddaughter was sitting on the floor in the corner with her knees pulled to her chest, wearing clothes she'd clearly been in for more than a day. She looked up at me and something in her face broke open completely. She'd lost weight that wasn't there to lose. Her eyes had that hollowed look I remembered from the oncology ward, that particular exhaustion that goes past tired into somewhere else. But it was her hands that stopped me cold. Both wrists had the same kind of marks, small, precise, in lines that were too regular to be accidental. Some of them were recent. Some had already begun to scar. I crouched down and I just held her for a moment. She was shaking. She kept apologizing. I told her to stop. I told her we were leaving right now. She said they'd told her she was unstable, that her husband had been documenting her behavior, mood episodes, confusion, irrational accusations. She said there were doctors who'd signed things, forms attesting to her mental state. She said no one would believe her because they'd been building the story for months. She said she was scared they'd have her committed the moment she tried to leave. I asked her where her husband was. She said downstairs. She said he'd been drinking since dinner and that's why she'd been able to call me. The window had been 2 hours at most. Footsteps on the stairs? Heavy ones. Her husband appeared in the doorway with his brother behind him. Her husband was in his late 30s, shirt untucked, eyes unfocused. He looked at me with an expression that was trying to be irritated and landing closer to uncertain. He said I had no idea what I'd just walked into. He said my granddaughter was receiving care. He said the marks on her arms were something she'd done to herself during episodes and they'd been trying to get her help. He said it the way someone says something they've practiced. Clinical and calm and completely hollow. I told him to get out of the doorway. He said he couldn't let her leave in her current state. His brother moved to the left. Her mother-in-law arrived behind them both. 3 people in a doorway at 5 in the morning. I was 67 years old and my right knee hadn't been right since a car accident in 2019. But I'd walked through harder things than this. I stood up, put my arm around my granddaughter, and walked straight at them. Her husband reached for her arm. I got between them. Her brother-in-law grabbed my shoulder from behind, and I drove my elbow back into his ribs hard enough that he let go. We went through them, and down the stairs, and out the front door without stopping. Her mother-in-law was still shouting about the police and their lawyers as I got my granddaughter into the passenger seat and drove away. In my rearview mirror, the 3 of them stood at the end of the driveway in the early morning dark, watching us go. They didn't follow. They'd already decided they'd won. My granddaughter drifted in and out of alertness during the drive. I kept talking to her, kept one hand on the steering wheel and one on her arm, not gripping, just present. I drove to Hamilton General because it was the closest major center and I wanted her somewhere with capacity. The emergency department at 6 in the morning is a particular kind of quiet. A nurse with a calm, efficient manner took my granddaughter back within 20 minutes. They wouldn't let me follow. I sat in a waiting room chair, and I didn't move for 2 hours. The attending physician who came to find me was young, maybe 35, with the careful manner of someone choosing every word deliberately. She told me my granddaughter was stable. She said the physical evidence of restraint and malnourishment was documented. Then she said there were substances in her system that shouldn't be there. a benzodiazepine at a level consistent with regular administration, an antipsychotic not prescribed to her, a third compound they were still working to identify. She said a combination like that, over weeks, would produce exactly the symptoms my granddaughter's in-laws had been describing as mental illness: confusion, mood instability, difficulty forming coherent memories. She said they were required by law to notify police. I thanked her and went back to my chair. The detective who arrived was OPP, seconded to a joint forces unit that handled organized fraud and abuse cases. Her name was Detective Sergeant Pauline Archambault. She was in her mid-40s, thorough, and she had the particular manner of someone who'd seen a lot and stopped being surprised by it. She asked me if I trusted her. I told her I'd spent 31 years working fraud cases, and I'd learned to answer that question slowly. She closed the interview room door and told me that the Caldwell name had appeared twice in complaints routed through the Ministry of Long-Term Care in the past 3 years. Both complaints had been administratively closed without explanation. She said she had a theory about why, but she needed evidence before she could act on it. She said, "Tell me everything, and I'll build what I can." I told her everything: the call, the estate, the door, the marks, the drugs, the manufactured psychiatric narrative. She took detailed notes without interrupting. When I finished, she said she had enough for assault and unlawful confinement charges. She said there might be more, but that depended on what else I could find. I drove back to Kingston that afternoon. My granddaughter was admitted for observation. I went home and I opened my laptop and I started working. 31 years of fraud investigation leaves you with certain skills. You know how to read financial statements that are trying not to be read. You know how to find the employee who left under circumstances that never quite got explained. You know how to follow the thread nobody was supposed to pull. I started with the Caldwell facilities. 6 locations, all licensed under the province's Long-Term Care Homes Act. All accredited, all with publicly available inspection reports that showed no major findings. The reviews on public health authority databases were mostly positive. But when I cross-referenced complaint submission dates with resolution dates, I found a pattern. Complaints filed and resolved within 4 days was statistically unusual. Not impossible, but unusual. Fast enough that a third-party reviewer would never have had time to actually investigate. A former colleague of mine who still contracted with the Ministry of Long-Term Care pulled me what he legally could. The Caldwell facilities collectively received approximately $42 million annually in provincial funding through OHIP and the long-term care envelope. That money came with obligations, staffing ratios, medication protocols, care standards. The facilities were audited, but the same 3 inspectors had signed off on every audit across all 6 locations for the past 5 years. I found 39 deaths at Caldwell facilities in the past 4 years that had occurred within 6 weeks of a formal complaint by the resident or a family member. Some had been ruled natural causes, some accidental. A few had been investigated by the coroner's office and closed. The rate wasn't impossible. Long-term care homes have high mortality by the nature of who they serve. But the clustering around complaint dates was not a coincidence. I knew it. I just needed to prove it. A man named my former colleague called me with a name. A nurse who had left the Burlington Caldwell location 14 months ago. She'd submitted a written statement to the ministry before leaving, and the statement had been received and filed and never acted upon. I tracked down her contact information through the provincial nursing registry. I called her from my landline. She picked up and said nothing for a long moment after I explained who I was and why I was calling. Then she said, "I've been waiting for someone to call. I just didn't think it would take this long." Her name was Angela. She'd worked in the Burlington facility for 4 years before submitting her statement. She told me she'd seen residents receive medication adjustments, not ordered by their attending physicians. She told me she'd raised it with the director of care and been told that the family had authorized everything and that questioning care protocols wasn't her role. She told me she'd written it all down. She said, "I kept copies of everything I documented. I put them somewhere safe before I left because I was scared they'd have me sign something to make it go away." She said the copies were in a safety deposit box at her credit union branch in Burlington. She'd never had a reason to open it since. Until now. 2 days later, I sat in a small room at the credit union while Angela opened the box. Inside were printed copies of medication administration records, internal shift notes, photographs of physical discrepancies she'd documented on her phone, and a 14-page handwritten account of everything she'd witnessed during her 4 years at the facility. There was also a sealed envelope with her sister's name on it. She told me she'd left it in case something happened to her. She said, "I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid. Now I'm not sure I was paranoid enough." I photographed everything with her permission. That evening I drove back to Kingston and uploaded every file to 3 separate encrypted servers. Then I called Detective Sergeant Archambault. She met me the following morning in a Tim Hortons off the 401 because she said she didn't want this conversation happening in any building connected to a government directory. She looked at what I had and was quiet for a long time. Then she told me she'd been in contact with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit for 6 weeks about the Caldwell Group. She said the provincial funding fraud alone was enough to open a federal investigation, but what I'd brought her moved it into something significantly larger. She said, "If we can prove that residents were being medicated without consent and that deaths were connected to that protocol, that's not just fraud. That's not administrative negligence." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She asked me a question I hadn't expected. She said she'd been building toward a moment where they could catch the Caldwells actively moving a resident against their will across a provincial boundary. She said there was a woman in the Kingston facility whose family had been requesting her transfer to a home closer to them in New Brunswick. The facility had been blocking the transfer through administrative delays. She said if they could document an attempt to move that resident under conditions that didn't comply with consent regulations, that created federal jurisdiction under the criminal code. She said the timing was close. She said she needed someone inside who could carry a recording device and who the Caldwells wouldn't recognize as a threat. I told her I didn't like where this was going. My granddaughter called me that same evening from the hospital. She said she'd been thinking. She said she wanted to be part of whatever came next. I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Grandpa, listen to me. I know what they did. I know exactly how they work because I lived inside it. If I can help stop them from doing it to someone else, I need to do that." I said she'd already been through enough. She said, "I know. That's exactly why I need to do this." I didn't sleep that night. I thought about Margaret, about what she would have said, about the fact that the woman I'd raised my granddaughter's mother to be had raised a daughter who would volunteer for something like this when she was barely recovered and still carrying marks on her wrists. I thought about what it meant that I'd spent 30 years chasing fraud and my granddaughter had spent 18 months living inside it, and the two of us had ended up in the same place on this particular morning. I called Detective Sergeant Archambault and told her my granddaughter wanted to help. I told her I would only agree if I had direct communication access throughout, if her team was positioned inside the response window, and if my granddaughter had final say to abort at any point without question. She said those were reasonable conditions. She said there would be surveillance at every access point. She said the moment anything moved outside the parameters, they would be in. She said, "Mr. Morrison, your granddaughter is one of the bravest people I've spoken to in 12 years of this work. I'm going to make sure she comes home safe." The plan was straightforward. My granddaughter would contact her husband and indicate she wanted to reconcile. She would agree to return to the Oakville estate for a conversation. RCMP and OPP joint surveillance would track her movements from the moment she left the hospital. A second team was positioned near the Kingston facility in case any action was taken there simultaneously. I would be on the phone with Archambault throughout. I watched her drive away from the hospital parking lot on a Thursday afternoon, and I have not felt that particular kind of cold before or since. She looked back once through the rear window. I lifted my hand. She turned back to face the road. The next 90 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot with my phone in my hand, and I watched the minutes change. At 40 minutes, Archambault called. She said they were inside the estate. She said her husband and his brother were present. She said her mother-in-law had arrived from somewhere else within 20 minutes of my granddaughter entering the property, which suggested they'd been prepared for this possibility. She said, "They're keeping her there." Moving toward the back of the property, "This is what we needed." My phone rang. Unknown number. The voice on the other end was her husband, relaxed and deliberate in the way that alcohol makes some people relaxed and deliberate. He said he had my granddaughter, and we both knew what that meant. He said I needed to bring everything I'd collected, every document, every file, every copy. He said if I came alone and delivered what I had, My granddaughter would be released unharmed, and the family would not pursue criminal charges against me for the break-in at the estate. He said it like he was offering me a reasonable deal. I said I'd be there in 2 hours. I called RCMP back. She said, "Perfect. Stay on script. Bring the copies. Drive slow." She said the real evidence was already with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit and the Federal Prosecutor's Office in Toronto. What I'd be bringing was a second set that looked identical but wouldn't hold up to authentication. She said, "David," she caught herself. She said, "Frank, let us do our jobs." I said, "You'd better." I drove the 401 toward Oakville with a laptop bag in my passenger seat and 31 years of fraud investigation keeping me functional when everything else inside me was doing something else entirely. I thought about the mother in Vermont from the original story's equivalent. I thought about every family I'd spoken to in the past 2 weeks. The son in Guelph, whose father had passed away 5 days after filing a complaint about medication protocols at the Burlington facility. The daughter in Barrie, whose mother had been found non-responsive the morning after she'd asked to change facilities. The brother in Hamilton, who said his sister had written him a letter that didn't sound like her at all, 2 weeks before she was gone. 3 families. 3 investigations that went nowhere because the right names were on the right boards and the right inspectors signed the right forms. The Oakville estate looked exactly as it had 5 days earlier. Every light on. Gate code still working. I walked to the front door, and it opened before I knocked. They took me down to the lower level of the property, a finished basement with the same expensive aesthetics as the main house, the same deliberate, tasteful calm. My granddaughter and the man I understood to be Angela's former director of care were seated with their hands secured behind their backs. My granddaughter's eyes found mine across the room, and something moved through her face. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. This is the moment. Okay. Her mother-in-law stood near the far wall in a cashmere sweater as though this were any other evening. Her husband put the laptop bag on the table and opened it. He paged through the files. He said it looked complete. Her mother-in-law looked at me. She said they appreciated my cooperation. She said once the files were confirmed and appropriately disposed of, everyone present would sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement, and the entire matter would be resolved privately. She said my granddaughter's ongoing care would be managed by professionals and that I was welcome to receive regular updates through appropriate channels. She said it with the particular confidence of someone who had done this before and watched it work. I said I was glad she felt that way. I said I wanted to be clear about something. I said I hadn't come alone. The lights went out. Emergency lighting came on, casting everything in low red, and then her own voice began playing through the speakers. A recording from 20 minutes earlier in the living room upstairs. Her mother-in-law's voice, saying, "He'll bring what we asked for. Once we have it, we take care of all 3 of them, and we move the granddaughter to the Burlington property. No one is filing anything after tonight." Her mother-in-law went completely still. Her husband dropped the laptop bag. Detective Sergeant Archambault came through the door behind 6 tactical officers with RCMP and OPP identification. She was wearing a vest that said police across the back in yellow letters. She walked directly to the mother-in-law and began reading her rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms with the calm, even pace of someone who had been looking forward to this particular sentence for a long time. My granddaughter's hands were cut free. She crossed the room to me and we stood there while the Caldwell family was processed around us. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. Sometimes there isn't anything to say. The charges took time to organize and they were substantial. Forcible confinement, criminal negligence causing harm, fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code, breach of trust in the context of provincial health funding, conspiracy, and in 3 cases, criminal negligence causing death, the most serious charge available where intent falls short of murder but the outcome is the same. The federal prosecution ran parallel to the provincial one and was handled by a team in Toronto whose lead prosecutor had spent the previous 8 years on organized crime. She told me during one of the pretrial meetings that she'd never seen a more completely documented fraud operation in 14 years of practice. The trials ran separately. Her mother-in-law's was the longest, 14 weeks. I sat in the gallery of the Ontario Superior Court every day it was in session. The evidence was introduced methodically. Angela's records, the medication administration discrepancies, The complaint-to-death clustering analysis that an independent forensic statistician testified had a probability of natural occurrence of less than 1%. The financial records showing payments to 3 provincial inspectors and 1 Ministry of Long-Term Care official totaling more than $800,000 over 6 years. Rebecca Miller's equivalent Angela's documentation from the safety deposit box formed the center of the Crown's case. Her mother-in-law received 12 years on the primary counts of fraud, criminal negligence causing death, and conspiracy. The judge addressed her directly at sentencing. He said the Caldwell family had operated a system that exploited some of the most vulnerable people in Ontario, while presenting a face of compassionate care to the public, to regulators, and to families who trusted them with people they loved. He said no sentence would be adequate to that harm. He gave her what the law allowed. Her husband received 8 years for forcible confinement, assault, criminal negligence, causing harm, and conspiracy. His brother received 6 years for his role in the operation and the events of that basement. The director of care received 9 years after it emerged. He had been the operational architect of the medication protocol from the beginning, that he had known what the protocol produced, and that he had continued it. 3 provincial inspectors were charged federally. The ministry official received the heaviest sentence of the secondary defendants, 4 years after a guilty plea entered 2 weeks before he would have gone to trial. The Caldwell facilities were ordered closed, all 6 locations. Their assets were seized and a victim compensation fund of $11 million was established through a combination of seized proceeds and provincial settlement funding. 51 residents or their families came forward and were recognized by the fund. Every one of them. My granddaughter started working with a patient advocacy organization in Hamilton 6 months after the verdicts. She consults on care home complaint processes and she speaks to families who feel like they're not being heard. I went to one of the sessions she facilitated. I sat in the back and watched her listen to a woman from Ancaster describe what had happened to her father. And I watched my granddaughter hold that, without flinching, without looking away. Margaret would have been so proud. A letter arrived at my Kingston address 3 months after sentencing. It came from a federal institution in Quebec. Her husband, he said I had destroyed his family. He said he had people I didn't know about and that I should be careful. He said when he was out, things would be different. I photographed it on both sides, forwarded the images to Archambault and to the federal prosecutor's office in Toronto, and filed the original in the accordion folder I keep in my home office beside the desk where I work every morning. Let him write. Every letter goes into the record and onto his parole file. He'll figure that out eventually. 2 weeks after the letter, my granddaughter called, not at 3:47 inches the morning. At 11 on a Sunday, the kind of call you take with a cup of coffee in your hand and no particular urgency anywhere in your chest. She said a family had contacted the advocacy organization. A son in Sudbury. His mother was in a private care facility outside North Bay. She'd called him 3 times in the past month asking him to come get her. The facility's administration had told him she was confused and that the calls were part of her cognitive decline. He wasn't sure. He said something just felt wrong. I put my coffee down and pulled my notepad across the desk. I wrote down the son's name and the name of the facility and the date of the first call. My granddaughter said, "Grandpa, are you sure you want to keep doing this?" I said, "I made your grandmother a promise." She said, "I know. I just wanted to make sure you knew you didn't have to do it alone anymore. I'm 67 years old. My right knee aches every morning until the 3rd cup of coffee kicks in. I get tired at 9:30 on weeknights, and I don't apologize for it. But I also spent 31 years learning exactly how people hide what they don't want found. And there are families in this province right now who are being told to trust the process and not ask difficult questions and sign things they shouldn't sign. There are people in facilities tonight who are being medicated into confusion and having that confusion used as evidence that they can't speak for themselves. I made Margaret a promise, and I keep my promises. If this story tells you anything, let it tell you this. Trust the feeling that something is wrong. I ignored it once for too long because I told myself I was projecting, that I saw corruption everywhere because of what I'd lost. I second-guessed my instincts, and my granddaughter paid for that with 18 months inside a situation that should never have lasted 18 days. The people who operate systems like the Caldwells count on exactly that. They count on you doubting yourself. They count on the money and the credentials and the glossy materials being enough to make you feel foolish for asking questions. Do not feel foolish for asking questions. And do not wait until the call comes at 3:47 inches the morning. By then you're already running to catch up. These stories I share aren't fiction. This happened in Ontario. It happened in facilities that were licensed and inspected and accredited. It happened to a family that looked, from the outside, like they had everything sorted out. If it can happen to them, it can happen to anyone. So pay attention. Ask the difficult question. Make the call before someone you love has to make it for you. I'll be here either way.